I never set out to ruin anyone's life. I was just a journalist doing my job. But then I met Miles Carter, and everything changed. Carter wasn't just any CEO. He was the man everyone admired, the titan of industry, the self-made billionaire who built a financial empire from the ground up. His name was a brand, synonymous with success, power, and unyielding ambition. But behind the polished facade of the empire he ran, there were secrets. Dark, festering secrets that no one saw or chose not to see. I saw through it all. I first heard of Miles Carter in 2012. His company, Carter Holdings, had been making waves in the financial sector, and news outlets were practically bowing down to him. Everyone from Wall Street analysts to the government officials who passed policies in his favor praised his business acumen. But something about the way he kept dodging questions about the rapid expansion of his company struck me as odd. Numbers that didn't add up. Promises of sustainability that seemed too good to be true. In 2016, Carter made headlines again when his company announced an acquisition of a failing international bank for pennies on the dollar. The deal was so rushed, so one-sided, that I knew there had to be something going on beneath the surface. It wasn't just business strategy, it was manipulation on a scale that could ruin lives. That's when I decided to dig deeper. What I found was staggering. Miles Carter had been involved in insider trading, money laundering, and corporate fraud for over a decade. He had used his company as a front to siphon funds from unsuspecting investors, rigging deals, and even leveraging his power to exploit weak international markets. Behind closed doors, he made deals that allowed him to pocket millions while destroying thousands of jobs. But what really pissed me off was the fact that the system protected him. The SEC had known about him for years but had done nothing. They were all complicit, either out of fear or greed. But it wasn't just the financial destruction that made me hate him. It was the personal pain he'd caused. I spoke to families who had lost everything due to Carter's underhanded tactics. One woman, a single mother in her late 40s, had worked her whole life to build up a small but promising retirement portfolio. Carter's company, in its push to buy up smaller, vulnerable businesses, had wiped out her savings with a series of faulty stock schemes. She had to go back to work, taking a job as a janitor just to survive. The thought of it made my blood boil. At first, I tried to play it straight. I approached the case like any journalist would, carefully, methodically. But no one would listen. The banks, the regulators, the news organizations, all of them were too afraid to take on Carter. The power he had amassed made him untouchable. That's when I realized something. I couldn't just report on him. I couldn't just expose him. If I was going to get justice for the people he'd destroyed, I needed to take matters into my own hands. I'd been following him for months, gathering every piece of evidence I could. But I knew that wasn't enough. I needed something more. Something that would make even the most powerful people tremble. I needed to destroy him, but not just financially. I needed to break him. To make him feel the pain of the lives he had ruined. I wasn't sure where it started, but it became personal for me. The idea that one man could have so much power over so many and never face the consequences. It ate at me. The first step was infiltration. I started by befriending the people closest to him. I didn't want to take a shortcut and get caught. No, this had to be done slowly, carefully, until the walls of his fortress crumbled without him even realizing it. I started with his inner circle. His assistant, his financial advisors, his closest colleagues. Each of them had their own skeletons, secrets they were desperate to keep hidden. And I knew that if I could expose them, I could find a way in. It took months, but I finally managed to gain access to one of his former assistants, a young woman named Rachel. She was bright, eager, and entirely too trusting. She'd worked with Carter for over 5 years and had intimate knowledge of his operations. At first, she was hesitant to talk, but as I began feeding her carefully placed pieces of information about his unethical behavior, she started to open up. One night, I was able to convince her to show me a series of emails and documents, the very same ones that proved Carter's involvement in laundering money through offshore accounts. These were the kind of smoking guns that could bring a man like him to his knees. I had everything I needed to expose him, or so I thought. Then, everything changed. The deeper I dug, the more I discovered that Carter was aware of me. At first, I didn't believe it. He was a CEO, a billionaire with the world at his feet. Why would he care about a lowly investigative journalist? But I started noticing strange things. My phone lines would suddenly go dead in the middle of conversations. I received cryptic warnings from people I had never met, suggesting that I stop poking around. And then one night, I found a note slipped under my door. Leave it alone, Ethan. You're digging too deep. You have no idea what you're getting into? I knew what it meant. Miles Carter had been tracking me. He knew what I was doing and he wasn't going to let it happen. The threats escalated. I found my car tampered with, the brakes cut. My computer was hacked, and personal information from my past was leaked online. But I didn't stop. Not even when it became clear that Carter had hired private investigators to follow me. Not even when my life began to feel like it was slipping from my hands. The turning point came when I uncovered the full extent of his personal life, the things he hid from the public. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a liar and a cheat in every aspect of his life. His marriage to his wife, Clara, was a sham. He'd been having an affair with a younger woman, a colleague at his company, for over 2 years. Claire had known, of course. She'd known and turned a blind eye because the money and power were worth it. She had her own secrets, her own backroom deals that kept her in Carter's world. I knew this would be my way in. The affair was the lever I needed to pry open the cracks in his perfect world. I began to plant seeds of doubt. I left anonymous messages for Clara, dropping hints about the affair, leading her to find the evidence herself. She had to be the one to discover the truth, to confront him. I needed her to destroy him from the inside out. But then, just when I thought I had him cornered, the worst possible thing happened. Rachel, the assistant I'd trusted, betrayed me. She handed over everything I'd given her to Carter. Every email, every document, every detail of my plan. I had been so close, but now it was slipping away. Carter knew what I was up to. He had set a trap for me all along. The emails had been planted, the documents doctored. Everything I thought I had was part of his game. He had played me, manipulated me into doing his bidding without ever lifting a finger. I should have seen it coming. Miles Carter wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator, and I had underestimated him. But that wouldn't stop me. If anything, it made me more determined. He thought he had me beat, but he didn't know the half of it. My revenge would be even sweeter than I'd originally planned. I wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. The air at the Carter family's estate that evening was thick with unease, and I could almost feel it settle around my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was all I had left. Miles Carter was a master at hiding his true self, but tonight I was going to make sure he couldn't hide behind his polished exterior. The gathering was supposed to be a casual family dinner, an annual tradition that allowed everyone to put on their best faces and pretend things were fine. But I had other plans. I'd managed to get an invitation through one of my sources, someone close to Miles' PR team, and had worked my way in as an almost guest. I wasn't exactly welcomed, but I wasn't an outsider either. I'd been embedded in their world long enough that they thought I was harmless. They didn't know what I was capable of. When I walked into the sprawling estate, the grandeur of it hit me immediately. The vast living room was filled with expensive art pieces, sparkling chandeliers, and high-end furniture. Everything about the place screamed wealth and power. And Miles, of course, was the puppet master at the center of it all. He stood in the corner, talking animatedly to a group of men in suits who clearly hung on his every word. His smile was warm, but there was a coldness behind it that I knew all too well, the kind of smile someone wears when they know they control the room. But tonight, I wasn't going to let him control me. Sophie, his wife, was beside him, looking as immaculate as ever. She was dressed in a floor-length red silk gown that made her seem like she belonged in a magazine spread rather than a family dinner. Her beauty was undeniable, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that made me wonder how much she knew about her husband's true nature. How much was she willing to turn a blind eye to? As soon as she saw me, her smile faltered for just a moment. It was small, but I caught it. She knew I was trouble. She must have, after all the whispers and rumors about me getting too close to the truth. But her professionalism quickly kicked in, and she extended a hand to greet me, the smile back in place. "Ethan, it's so nice to finally meet you," she said, her voice smooth and calculated, like a perfectly rehearsed line. I took her hand, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The pleasure's all mine, Sophie. It's a beautiful home you have here." "Thank you," she replied, though I could see the subtle tension in her posture. "Miles and I are very proud of it." Behind her, I saw Miles giving me a sideways glance, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he recognized me, not as a friend, but as a threat. "Ah, Ethan," Miles said, his voice rich with the authority of a man who was used to being in control. "I didn't expect you here tonight, but it's good to have you. How's the latest project going? Are you still digging around in the financial sector?" I smiled, the kind of smile that I knew would irritate him. "Still digging, Miles? Some things never change." I let the words hang in the air, thick with implications. His eyes flickered for just a second, but he quickly masked his discomfort with another practiced grin. "We'll see what you uncover, then," he said, and though his words were light, I could see the warning in them. He was trying to assert dominance, trying to remind me that no matter how much I thought I knew, he controlled the narrative. The dinner table was set in the grand dining room, and as everyone took their seats, the tension in the air seemed to increase. The family gathered around, exchanging pleasantries, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. The guests, a mixture of business associates and a few of Miles' old friends from college, were all too busy flattering each other to notice the unspoken tension between Miles and me. But Sophie knew. She could feel it too. As the meal progressed, I leaned into my plan. I asked questions, subtle but pointed, that would make Miles uncomfortable. It was nothing overt. Nothing that would outright expose him, but just enough to rattle him. "Funny thing," I said, casually leaning back in my chair as I sipped my wine, "I was looking into some of the charity initiatives you've been a part of, Miles. I have to say, I'm impressed by how much you give back. But I couldn't help but wonder, with all the deals you've closed over the years, is there a particular one that really stands out as being pivotal to your success?" The question wasn't just about the charity work. I knew that asking about his deals would force him to think about the ones that might have been illegal, shady, or just plain exploitative. I saw the brief flash of discomfort cross his face, and then it was gone, replaced by the kind of smile he used when he needed to steer the conversation away from something he didn't want people to probe into. "Well, Ethan, as you know, success is a combination of hard work, timing, and the ability to recognize opportunities. I've been fortunate to make a few good decisions along the way." He didn't answer the question, of course. He deflected. But I wasn't done. I pushed a little further, leaning in slightly as if sharing a secret. "That's true, but I've been hearing rumors about some of those opportunities, about the way you're able to manipulate stock prices and acquisitions. I imagine it's a fine line between genius and something else when you're dealing with billions of dollars, huh?" I felt the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. Miles' face tightened, and his jaw clenched, but Sophie was quick to step in. "Let's not get into business talk tonight, Ethan," she interjected, her voice sharp but smooth, like an expert mediator trying to ease the tension. "We're here to enjoy a family meal, not discuss work." Her tone was professional, but it was clear she was trying to keep things from escalating. She knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly what she was trying to do: distract, deflect, control the narrative. But I wasn't going to let her. "I'm just curious," I said, a grin playing on my lips. "I think we all are. We all have questions, don't we? Questions about how a company goes from nothing to something as quickly as Carter Holdings did. And it's not just about hard work, is it? It's about who you know, the deals you make, the people you step on." At this point, even the other guests were beginning to notice the change in atmosphere. The room grew quieter. The once lively chatter slowed to murmurs. Sophie, ever the professional, tried to cover it up by raising her glass in a toast. "To family and to success," she said, but her eyes never left me. They were watching me, wary now. I didn't take the bait. I wasn't here to play games with polite conversation. I was here to break down the walls he'd built around himself, to get under his skin in a way that would make him crack. The more I pressed, the more I could see it in his eyes. The fear, the guilt. He didn't just know I was onto him. He knew I was going to expose him for everything he was. But Miles wasn't done yet. He had his own tricks up his sleeve. As the dinner wore on, I could feel the walls closing in. His eyes stayed on me, cold and calculating, and Sophie's attempts to steer the conversation were becoming more desperate. The evening ended in an uncomfortable silence, but I could tell something had changed. The cracks were starting to show. And this was just the beginning. The night after the family dinner felt strangely anticlimactic. I had expected more, a confrontation, maybe, or a slip-up on Miles' part. But the evening had been nothing but tension, small talk, and carefully controlled smiles. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was coming for him, but he wasn't ready to fold just yet. No, Miles Carter was a man who'd learned how to survive, how to hide behind layers of wealth and power. But I wasn't backing down. As I left the estate, my mind raced with the possibilities. The dinner had only been the beginning, a prologue to what was to come. The next step was clear. Expose him, but in a way that would hit him where it hurt most. The corporate world, especially the financial one, ran on a foundation of trust. And once that trust was shattered, it wasn't easy to rebuild. The information I had gathered on Miles was enough to bring him down, but the real question was how to make the most impact. I didn't need to go public just yet. That would be too clean, too easy. No, I needed to be subtle, surgical, like a shadow that crept into the cracks of his empire and threatened to tear it apart from the inside. It wasn't just about his illegal deals or the offshore accounts I had uncovered. It was about sending a message. I wasn't just going after his business, I was going after the network he had built. The web of creditors, investors, and financial partners who were the true enablers of his empire. The ones who kept him standing even when everything around him threatened to collapse. The plan started to form in my mind like a blueprint. I had spent weeks combing through emails, transactions, and insider information, all provided by Rachel. Her betrayal still stung, but she had given me the tools I needed. Now it was time to use them. I set up a new email account. Anonymous, untraceable, a perfect vessel for my message. The first batch of emails I sent out went to a handful of Miles' top creditors, the ones who had the most invested in Carter Holdings. These weren't just random banks or faceless institutions. These were people who trusted him, people who thought they were backing a legitimate business. I knew these were the people who would get nervous the moment they realized they'd been lied to, the ones whose fear would cause ripples through Carter's world. The email was short and to the point. It contained evidence, the documents Rachel had stolen, the emails between Carter and his overseas financial contacts, the transactions, the fraudulent acquisitions. It painted a clear picture of Miles' financial misconduct, of how he had manipulated the market to line his pockets while throwing others under the bus. No names, no fingerprints, just facts. Subject: urgent financial misconduct at Carter Holdings, immediate attention required. Dear creditor's name. This is an anonymous tip regarding significant financial misconduct involving Miles Carter and Carter Holdings. The attached documents contain evidence of fraudulent transactions, illegal stock manipulations, and the use of offshore accounts to launder money. Please review the materials carefully, as they may affect your current and future dealings with Carter Holdings. This is not a hoax. Miles Carter's actions are being investigated, and we strongly advise you to review your exposure to Carter Holdings immediately. Yours sincerely, anonymous source. I sent the email, and with it, a sense of satisfaction that was almost addictive. The next day, I waited. It didn't take long for the first ripple to appear. I started receiving calls from a few of the creditors, nervous inquiries about the documents, questions about the legitimacy of the accusations. They weren't sure whether to believe it at first, but the doubts were planted. Miles Carter was no longer untouchable. His empire was crumbling, one layer at a time. The first sign of trouble came from one of Carter's largest institutional investors, a major hedge fund that had backed his last big acquisition. The fund manager called Miles directly, his voice thick with unease. I didn't know the details of the conversation, but I could guess. I could imagine the frustration in Miles' voice, the smooth, calculated words he would have used to calm the man down, to reassure him that everything was under control. But I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Within hours, the emails had started to have an impact. I watched from the shadows as creditors pulled back, questioning their continued financial support. The phone calls started coming in faster, one after the other. It was as if the house of cards was shaking and every tiny gust of wind made it lean further into collapse. The best part? Miles had no idea where the leaks were coming from. He was scrambling, trying to figure out who had gotten their hands on the sensitive information. But he wouldn't find me. Not now. Not yet. His first major problem came when one of his international banking partners, a European firm he'd relied on for years, froze several accounts tied to Carter Holdings. The funds were suddenly unavailable, no explanation given. The news hit hard, and Miles immediately sprang into action, pulling strings, making calls. But I knew what was coming next. His entire operation was tied to a web of financial institutions that were beginning to question their involvement with him. Sophie, of course, was right by his side, trying to smooth things over, playing the perfect wife and PR manager. I could almost hear her voice on the other end of the phone calls, her calm tone attempting to reassure the investors, the creditors, anyone who would listen. She was good at what she did, but even she couldn't shield him from the storm that was beginning to brew. From my end, I watched as the drama unfolded, my satisfaction growing with every little piece of chaos. But this wasn't just about causing trouble. This was justice. Real, tangible consequences. The next day, I received a call from one of the creditors. It wasn't the hedge fund manager, but one of his associates, someone lower on the food chain. A mid-level financial analyst who had clearly been caught in the middle of this mess. His voice was tense, almost pleading. "Mr. Brooks, I don't know how you got this information, but it's all true, isn't it? The offshore accounts, the inflated stock prices, the market manipulations. We've been digging into it, and it's worse than we thought." I had to smile. The walls were closing in, and the rats were starting to scurry. I stayed calm, keeping my voice steady, but my satisfaction was unmistakable. "You should be careful too," I said softly. "You're in deeper than you think. This goes all the way to the top. Miles Carter's empire is built on lies. You might want to distance yourself before it all comes crashing down." The analyst hesitated, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "We're already looking at our options. The lawyers are involved." I could feel the cracks widening, the foundation of Carter's world beginning to split. Sophie, no doubt, was working overtime to protect their assets, but even she couldn't manage the mess that was unfolding. As I hung up, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. This was just the beginning. The first wave had crashed, but there was still so much more to come. Miles Carter had built his empire on lies, but now the truth was out there, swirling in the wind. And no one could stop it. The end was coming. The sense of inevitability hung heavy in the air as the next phase of my plan came together. The creditors were already skittish, pulling back their investments, freezing accounts. Miles Carter's empire was on shaky ground, and I could practically feel the tremors beneath it. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to hit him where it would hurt the most, where the damage would be permanent. His reputation. Miles had spent years building an image of himself as the untouchable king of finance, a brilliant visionary who could do no wrong. The press adored him. The business world admired him. But the truth was always lurking, and now it was time for everyone to see it, to make it undeniable. I had already sent anonymous emails to his creditors, and now I was ready to escalate. The next target was the most dangerous one. His own employer, the board of directors and the key players within Carter Holdings. They were the ones who had turned a blind eye for so long, the ones who had benefited from his manipulations and shady deals. But if I could make them see the truth, if I could get the evidence into their hands, it would force their hand. They would have no choice but to turn on him. I knew how to do it. Miles' company had been in the press for years, and they prided themselves on their image of integrity. They had a team of lawyers, PR experts, and compliance officers whose job it was to maintain the illusion of perfection. But beneath that polished surface, the cracks were wide enough for me to slip through unnoticed. I started with a series of anonymous emails. This time, I wasn't dealing with just one or two individuals. No, this time I was targeting the heart of Carter Holdings. The board members, senior executives, the people who kept the company running smoothly while Miles played the part of the genius. The emails were carefully crafted, written to hit the right notes of urgency and undeniable evidence. Attached were documents proving everything: the false earnings reports, the offshore shell companies, the insider trading schemes. Everything that Miles had hidden, everything that made his fortune a house of cards. Subject: Urgent, uncovering fraudulent practices at Carter Holdings. Dear board member's name. I am writing to inform you of serious financial misconduct within Carter Holdings. As someone who has had access to sensitive financial information, I believe it is my duty to bring this to light. The attached files contain evidence of insider trading, false financial reporting, and money laundering through offshore accounts. These practices, if left unchecked, could bring irreversible damage to the company and its stakeholders. I strongly advise you to review this material immediately and take appropriate action. Yours sincerely, anonymous source. I sent the emails and then I waited. I didn't know exactly when the first of them would land on the right desk, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Miles wasn't aware of what I was doing. He was too caught up in damage control with his creditors, too focused on trying to salvage what little he could of his crumbling empire. He wasn't watching his back anymore. The first signs of trouble came within hours. I received a call late that night. It was from a lawyer, one of the senior partners at a firm representing Carter Holdings. He was polite, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Mr. Brooks, he began, I understand that you've been circulating certain materials related to our client, Mr. Miles Carter. I need to make it clear that any attempt to defame or harm the reputation of our client will not be tolerated. We are prepared to take legal action. I smiled to myself. They had taken the bait. Of course, they would threaten me first. It was a predictable move. But what they didn't realize was that they were already on the back foot. By the time they started issuing threats, the documents had already made their way to the board members. The damage was already done. The following morning, the fallout began. First came the meetings, closed-door, high-stakes sessions between the board members, the company's legal team, and their PR experts. I could almost hear the tension in the air, the whispers that must have run through the hallways as those closest to Miles began to realize the extent of his misdeeds. For the first time, they had no choice but to face the truth. I knew the moment the crisis broke. The phone started ringing again, but this time, it wasn't the creditors or the lawyers. This time, it was the press. Journalists who had long been enamored with Miles and his so-called empire were calling for comment. The reporters I had worked with over the years had caught wind of what was happening, and they were desperate for a story. The press had finally turned on him. The dam was breaking. The first public statements from Carter Holdings came quickly. A generic, heavily scripted response to the allegations, claiming that they were looking into the accusations and would cooperate with the necessary investigations. It was the kind of statement every company gives when they know their reputation is on the line, when they're trying to hold back the flood. But the damage was done. The very next day, a report leaked to the press confirming that an internal investigation was underway. The board had called an emergency meeting, and suddenly, Miles Carter wasn't the CEO he once was. He was a liability. Sophie was nowhere to be found during the early hours of the crisis. She had to be on the phone, handling the PR, keeping the wolves at bay. I could almost picture her, cool, calm, and calculating, trying to keep up appearances, trying to contain the damage. But I knew that no matter how many spin doctors she had, there was no saving Miles now. By the time the press had fully caught wind of the scandal, it was too late for him to recover. Investors were pulling out. Creditors were demanding repayment. The stock value of Carter Holdings plummeted. Miles' name was being dragged through the mud. The company's reputation, which had once been untouchable, was now a sinking ship, and Miles was at the helm, trying in vain to steer it clear of the iceberg. In the weeks that followed, the whispers became louder. Internal investigations, government audits, and media reports started to paint a clearer picture of the man behind the empire. The leaks from within Carter Holdings didn't stop. The truth was spilling out in all directions, faster than Miles could control it. His once untouchable status was being stripped away, layer by layer. And yet, Despite the public shame, despite everything, I knew that Miles hadn't lost everything. He was a survivor, always had been. There was still money in his offshore accounts, still influence in the financial world. But I didn't care about the details. Miles Carter was done. His reputation was shattered. His career was on life support. I had broken him. And that was the point. Justice had been served. The final step of my plan had always been the confrontation. I'd already torn down Miles' career, stripped him of the empire he'd spent years building. But there was something even more personal that I needed to expose, something that would make him feel the betrayal from the inside out. It was time to confront him about his secret, the one that no one else knew, the one that had haunted me for months. Sophie. It had taken time to put the pieces together. Rachel had given me the initial information, small details that seemed insignificant at first but, when woven together, painted a much darker picture. Sophie wasn't just Miles' wife, she was his accomplice. But that wasn't all. She was also something more. I had proof now. Proof that they had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. I stood outside the sleek, glassy building that housed Carter Holdings, watching as the day's light faded. The city was quiet, the streets buzzing with people too focused on their own lives to know what was about to unfold. But tonight, Miles would learn the price of his deceit. I walked into the building, the elevator ride feeling longer than it was. I knew I had to make this count. No more games. No more subtle digs. I had him now, and I wasn't going to give him a chance to talk his way out of it. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, I saw him there, standing at the massive windows overlooking the city. He was staring out, his back to me, as if he was lost in thought, probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong. His suit, the expensive one he always wore, looked out of place in the cold, sterile office. "Miles," I said, my voice breaking the silence. He turned, his eyes flashing with recognition, but also something else. A flicker of fear. The kind of fear a man who's just realized he's lost everything tries to bury beneath an ironclad expression. "What do you want, Ethan?" His voice was controlled, but there was a tremor beneath it, like he knew this moment was coming. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. The results of the DNA test were neatly folded inside, the evidence that would expose everything. I placed it on the table in front of him, watching his eyes follow the folder's path with a growing sense of dread. "What's this?" he asked, but there was no confidence in his voice. I could see the cracks starting to show. "You don't recognize it?" I asked, my tone cold, deliberate. "It's the DNA test, Miles. The one that proves you're not just connected to Sophie in business. You're connected to her in ways you never wanted anyone to know." He stared at the folder, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about?" I leaned forward, the moment finally here. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been lying to everyone, your wife, your investors, your employees, and to me. But now I've got the truth." His breath hitched, and for the first time in our entire interaction, I saw something crack in him. The facade of the powerful, untouchable CEO began to slip away, replaced by the man who had betrayed me, his family, and his own company. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered, his voice desperate. "You don't have the full story." "I don't need the full story, Miles. I've got enough to bring you down. To expose everything." I looked him dead in the eyes. "To expose how you and Sophie, how you're both guilty of so much more than anyone realizes." For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes darted around the room as though he was trying to find a way out, some escape. But he knew, deep down, that there was no way to escape the truth. "This is over, Miles," I said softly. "You've destroyed people's lives, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. You can't hide behind your money, your lies, or your wife anymore." The silence in the room was suffocating. Miles didn't try to deny it anymore. Instead, I saw it, the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was cornered. He wasn't the all-powerful CEO anymore. He was just a man, exposed, vulnerable. I didn't need to say anything else. The evidence spoke for itself. Miles Carter was finished. The trial was nothing short of a spectacle. When I filed the 2 lawsuits, one against Miles for financial fraud and the other against Sophie for financial manipulation, I knew what I was walking into. The legal world was a battlefield, and I was about to face an army of expensive lawyers hired by two of the most powerful people in the business world. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. After everything I'd exposed, the truth was on my side. The first lawsuit was straightforward. Miles Carter had defrauded investors, manipulated stock prices, and siphoned funds through offshore accounts. I had more than enough evidence. The documents, the emails, the testimony of whistleblowers. It was airtight. Sophie, however, was more complicated. She wasn't just the wife of a criminal. She was deeply involved in the financial dealings that had allowed Miles to maintain his empire. She'd used her position as his PR manager to cover up illegal transactions, making sure that the public never saw the dark side of Carter Holdings. She had actively manipulated the company's financial records, turning a blind eye to the damage it caused in exchange for the luxury and power she enjoyed. The courtroom was filled with tension from the start. I could see Miles sitting there, his face drained of color, his once confident demeanor shattered. Sophie, too, was different from the woman I had once known. Gone was the polished, carefully composed PR manager. In her place was a woman who knew her world was crumbling. She sat rigid, her eyes constantly darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. As the trial unfolded, I saw them both for what they were: liars, manipulators, people who had used their charm, their wealth, and their power to crush anyone who stood in their way. The witnesses testified, the documents were presented, and with each passing day, it became clearer that their empire had been built on lies. Sophie's defense was weak at best. She tried to argue that she had been unaware of the full extent of the fraudulent dealings, claiming she was just doing her job as PR manager. But the evidence I had, emails, financial reports, and her personal involvement in the cover-up, destroyed her defense. There was no denying her complicity. Miles tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the cracks starting to form. He fought back with every legal maneuver he could muster, using his power and influence to twist the truth. But nothing worked. The mountain of evidence was too overwhelming, too undeniable. His reputation, once untouchable, had crumbled to dust. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the verdict. I sat in the courtroom, my heart pounding, waiting for the judge to deliver the final blow. We find the defendant, Miles Carter, guilty of financial fraud and corporate misconduct, the judge said. We also find the defendant, Sophie Carter, guilty of financial manipulation and complicity in the illegal activities that were carried out under the guise of Carter Holdings. The courtroom was still for a moment, and then the air seemed to rush out, as if a collective breath had been held and finally released. Miles' face twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief, but I could see it in his eyes. The fear, the realization that this was the end. Sophie's expression was even worse. Her eyes, once sharp and confident, were wide with shock. The years of manipulation, the lies she had built her life on, they were all falling apart now. I sat there, silent, feeling a sense of cold satisfaction wash over me. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure that people like Miles and Sophie would never again be allowed to destroy others' lives without facing consequences. They had used their power to trample over anyone who got in their way, but now they would have to face the judgment of the law. The public fallout was immediate and devastating. News outlets ran headlines about the trial, about the massive financial fraud committed by Carter Holdings. Miles' name was smeared across every newspaper, every news station. Sophie was no better off. The PR campaigns she had orchestrated to protect her husband, to maintain the illusion of their perfect life, were useless now. Within days, both were forced to resign from their positions. Miles lost his CEO title, and Carter Holdings went into damage control mode, trying to salvage what little reputation they had left. Their names were tarnished beyond repair. No amount of money or influence could protect them from the truth anymore. For me, it was a moral victory, not just because I had exposed them, but because I had given the victims of their schemes a voice. I had helped bring justice to those whose lives had been ruined by their greed. People who had lost everything, who had been lied to and betrayed, finally saw that someone cared enough to fight for them. The courtroom verdict was only the beginning. Miles and Sophie had been destroyed publicly, their names forever linked to one of the biggest corporate scandals in history. And as for me, well, I had done what I set out to do. I had exposed them, I had brought them down, and I had ensured that their legacy would be one of shame, not success. I had no illusions about what came next. The world would move on. But for me it was enough. They were finished and I had won.